Course. Hi, everyone. Welcome to tonight's virtual event with Brookline Booksmith featuring Elizabeth A.I. Powell and Mark Wunderlich for their books, Atomizer and God of Nothing. My name is Bree Tribuna, and I am the Assistant Events Director at Brookline Booksmith in Brookline, Mass. If you're familiar with our store, welcome back. If this is your first time hearing about us, welcome. We're very happy to have you all join our community this evening, and we appreciate your support of the authors and independent bookstore through your purchase and attendance. The chat and question box are open, so feel free to make use of those. Remember to set your chat to all panelists and attendees so that you can talk to other people in the audience. And please drop your questions into the Q&A box at the bottom of the Zoom window. Chat can move pretty quickly, and we don't want to lose any of those questions. Please note that Brookline Booksmith has a strict policy against abusive behavior and language, and at our discretion, any attendee can be removed from an event for partaking in such behavior. Tonight, we are joined by two amazing and accomplished authors. Elizabeth A.I. Powell is the author of Atomizer, two previous collections of poetry, and a novel concerning the Holy Ghost interpretation of J. Crew catalogs. She is an associate professor of writing and literature at Northern Vermont University and editor at Green Mountains Review. Elizabeth's latest collection, Atomizer, explores fragrance and perfumery as a means of biological and religious seduction, evoking Whitman's sentiment that we are all made of the same atoms. Atomizer looks towards an underestimated scent, as a way to decipher the liminal spaces around us. We are also joined by Mark Wunderlich, an author of Earth of Veils, Voluntary Servitude, and The Anchorage. He teaches at Bennington College. God of Nothingness is the book for those who have seen death up close and even quietly wished for it. In these poems, Mark asks, how is it that we can go on as those around us die? And why go on at all? This collection is an unflinching journal of solitude and survival, the prevailing comforts and wonders inherent in human experience. It is my pleasure to introduce you both tonight to Elizabeth Powell and Mark Wunderlich. Thank you both.
Thank you so much. I thought I'd start out reading a poem that's an ekphrastic poem based on Laurie Simon's photograph from her Lying Object series. So this poem's called Lying Perfume Bottle of Chanel pour Monsieur. Tell me everything, he said. That was the top note. That was what the scent would have said if it could also speak nouns: window, sun, woman, summer, filling the white-walled bistro. How oak mossy the world is, how odor is identity's first ardor. His scent opens a portal. He said I seemed worthy of its lemony, neroli blessings, its cocoa philosophy of my life didn't please me, so I created my life. The light wafts in the window, inflects the room with Vermont in June, languidly arriving on dust motes. I am an object ponging myself into capture's mendacities. His antediluvian cardamom yanks me, a jazz song my father listened to or a shape no geometry understands. There's something familiar about the animalic scent, the refined contradiction of all that presses into my plasticine skin. Not all scents register in the conscious mind. I hope to seize his cipher, accords inside me like Arcturus flickering. Reader, even the sky has a composition. He sips espresso, eats blueberries, his citrusy spell flirts the morning air. He plays the bow ideal elegantly. Now you tell me everything. I want the aromatics, how the blooming foliage comes over me like a perfume bottle's glass enclosure. I see out a Friday morning, the polite ambition of lovers. This memory an atomizer I'm sprayed out of. Tell me everything. He said it was advertised as a gentleman's scent in 1955 to open over a whole day. How it adorned madmen and rogue dukes of thus and such. Fantasy is what we create when we have nothing. left to say about a world that has left us trendy, fetishized, and empty. He researched me as an olfactory curator might, my social media Lysol life, how to turn moments into hyperrealism, daughter of the cold hard cell. Tell me everything. My father wearing this scent, tightening his tie, his capitalist's noose, thinking he's 007, slapping himself in the face. No woman can know him. Okay, so I'm going to turn it over to Mark.
Elizabeth, that was fantastic, and I'm going to have some questions for you, certainly, about it. What we've just, for anyone out there who's in the audience, what we've decided to do is we're going to sort of read back and forth and have some conversation in between, so as we talk about it. So I'm going to shift gears here a little bit and read a poem. We were just talking about this kind of cold, this sort of sweep of cold that's happening in the country right now, and I thought I would read this poem that is sort of about coldness in one way or another. It's called First Chill. This year I did not love the first snow, took no joy from the clean whiteness masking the contours of my yard, the last leaves stripped from the weeping beach to reveal its looping undercarriage. The ground hardened underfoot as the world froze in late November. I have secretly admired the first hard frost killing the garden, putting an end to its many failures, the beetles and rusts finally put to death, and which are hard not to see as moral judgments on my insufficient diligence. This year I put on the woolens, banked the stove with oak and elm, watched the snow feather down on the spruce, the grass still green under white, and I felt an uncommon dread for the inward turn that usually marks these days that end in early nights at home with their firelit contemplations, the dim privacy of the lamp encircling the pages of an open book. I wanted more, not of summer, with its swampy air and the nighttime amphibian whir, but of autumn, with its metallic skies swept with clouds, of the promise of something about to end, but not yet taken away. Above the Catskills, the peaks are veiled in a cloud of snow. This is where I think my dead have gone. My father and Lucy and John, the dead being impervious to cold, having left their bodies with us to cherish, but also to bury and to burn. I imagine them as they wander the high peaks, rippling like figures underwater, like figures one dreams and forgets, a shape drawn and erased, so only the pencil's impress remains. Now that they are frozen, I know they are truly dead. Let me let them go, I pray to the God of nothingness, who rules those icy bluestone peaks, who hides the world of the living underneath his coat of snow. He has taken them from me, and now I will them coldly to go. So, Elizabeth, how did you come to write a book that is thinking about scent, about smell, about fragrance? And eventually I'm going to ask you what kind of perfume you like anyway, but I want to sort of know, how did you arrive at? And in that poem, what I thought was so remarkable about that poem is the way in which it began to move and landed upon the father, and that image of the necktie, the capitalist's noose, as you called it, which he's sort of tightening it up around his neck. And I just love that sort of trajectory, that sweep, but I guess I'm really curious about how did you come to write a book about scent?
Thanks, Mark. Well, I'm interested in olfaction and olfactory art, right? Like, what are some expressionist scents? And Chandler Burr, who's written a lot about fragrance, is an olfactory curator at a museum in New York, and he's had some exhibitions that I'm really interested in. But I think the most important part for me of the perfume story is that my two mothers were both in the fashion industry, and one of them worked for a French perfume company. And even my sister, she was in the 80s. They used to have the perfume sprayers, and that was her job. And I was also a latchkey kid, and somehow I always made my way to this one perfume store where this woman, Ingrid, who was very like Scandinavian and beautiful and held my imagination, just let me sit there with her for hours amid the crystal of the perfume. So that's one way, just sort of thinking about perfume as an olfactory art and how that's played a role in my life, but also being a synesthete and having synesthesia and also the narrative of meeting somebody who is as interested in perfumery as I was, and that's sometimes hard to find. And so there was a conversation that came out of that as well.
Do you have a favorite perfume? Are you someone who just wears only one kind? Do you have lots of different kinds? Do you always wear it? Are there times, do you miss it when you don't?
Right now I'm sort of not wearing it. I think I wear it more in the summer because I don't like to wear it so much in enclosed spaces. But I really like Hermes Rhubarb a lot. And I tend to also go toward like vetiver scents. And for a long time, I just wore Chanel Cristal. And then somebody was like, that's an old lady perfume now, which it was like, made for people in their young 20s in the 80s. So that sort of startled me. But yeah, there are a lot of different ones that I like. And I switch them up and sort of collect samples. And whenever I go to a city, I try and get as many as I can.
Wow.
Talking about your poem, one thing I really admired about it was how was the pastoral sort of pastoral elemental and lyric elements that that really have this sense of place that's so rooted in the cold, and that idea of that the cold and the element of cold has so much power that it informs the dead, and the dead inform us in the poem through it. And it's almost as if the dead are like an apostrophe in the poem, like Keats's bright star, and it's almost like they are a star or they are a planet of their own. And I'm just interested in how place informs your writing in terms of how you relate to, the characters in your book, the dead, and the living through vis-a-vis place and the pastoral.
Yeah. Well, the so much of this book is really rooted in the place where I grew up, in my hometown in Wisconsin, and I've described it before as my childhood there, and the sort of pre-internet 70s and 80s. In many ways feels more like a 19th century childhood than a 20th century one. There's aspects of it that seem very remote now. And my connection to the place is always where, as I get older, it's beginning to it gets thinner all the time. And even though I have, my family founded the town, we're some of the earliest settlers there. And so, there's generations of dead Wunderlichs in the ground in that one place. And so a lot of the book is sort of kind of yearning toward that place, wanting to kind of maintain a connection to it, but also understanding that it's beginning to, to fade. And it also, this book, much of this book was written out of a period of time when many people, I had a number of people in my life die. So 8 people I was close to died in a period of a year. And it's the kind of thing that just sometimes happens when you kind of enter this stage of your life. It's something that occurs, but they weren't all old. Some of them were young, and a friend committed suicide, and it just seemed to be coming in these kind of waves. And so there was an urgency. There felt like an urgency to kind of remember and get things down as I was working on that book. But all of these people who I write about are also very much associated with a certain place, with like a place in which I encountered them. And when I work on poems, I'm very often just trying to kind of ground them, to give them, to describe things, to create a setting, and that the poem kind of occurs in a place. And so I think that's part of what I was probably aiming to do.
It makes me wonder too, like if there's an element of epigenetics to it, that there are biological memories inside you as the poet, as a speaker in the poem, of all of those Wunderlichs who are there, and with the land itself. And I've been thinking a lot lately about epigenetics and how we know things, and memories reside in us that aren't our memories. This idea of transmitting memories through biology, and I really get the sense that's at play too in your work about your hometown and the dead, that there's a constant conversation through place and also biology. Does that?
Well, here we are walking around in these bodies all the time that we've inherited from, these centuries of ancestors who were before us, right? It's this sort of thing that we have, in some ways, not that we have so little control about what form we're delivered into when that happens, and it's something that we inherit completely. And of course, this affects how we think and how we feel and how we experience the world and how we sense things. It's interesting to me to hear you say that your whole family has somehow had some connection with perfumery, with working with and I'm sort of wondering now, do you suppose there's some, is it just like having a family who's in the rag trade, or is it like it's just a family business, or is it something that you're all drawn to? Is it like you like smelling things, you like thinking about that stuff? I don't know, it's hard to know.
Like olfaction can be very erotic, and in terms of like Audre Lorde, like that eroticism has power, if you claim it. But also olfaction can smell, there can be horrible smells. I'll read a poem next where there are horrible smells. I think my mother went toward fashion and perfume because she grew up on a dairy farm where I spent a lot of time. But those scents are strong, and that Uranus scent of hay in a barn is that, you can catch notes of that in some very expensive French perfumes. But while olfaction is part of the erotic, it can also be used for gaslighting too, in a way, like the Chanel Pour Monsieur, it's like the 1955 beau ideal, but that's all an act, a persona, a mask that the scent is helping to try to create. So it's also kind of a disinformation campaign, or a hiding of who you really are. So the book deals also sort of with a little bit with online dating and smell dating, like where you take a t-shirt that you wear for 3 days and then you cut it up, and then the dating service sends a piece of it out, and then that's how they, if you both smell like, then they assign you to one another.
This is real? This is
yeah. I don't know if it exists anymore, but yes, it was real. And and then there's this French philosopher I love, Alain Badaud, who wrote this book in praise of love, and he talks about capitalism and online dating being the end of love because it sort of ends the random encounter. And he says love is a truth procedure, and we must have that randomness to it, otherwise it becomes simply a commercial venture, like smart bombs. We'll have smart dating. Anyway, I had this memory when I was on Match.com, years ago, of my grandmother looking through a book of sires, of Holstein bulls, and which she was picking out which one she was going to order the semen. And I was like, that reminded me of Match.com. So anyway, I'll read the poem. The Book of Sires, 1. In reality, it was a semen catalog, a print cursor to online dating, but for cows. The barn's romance filled with the stench of nitrogen. Graham's back to the land ambitions, her own mating disappointments, the milking room radio remunerating Chopin's preludes to barn cats amid the promise of herd genetic progress and economic relevance. She studied the book with weird affection, attentive predilection. She'd semaphore the insemination man which bulls to mate with her Holsteins, calf-weaned, unsuspecting on the moors, to make the best milkers, obtain prestige, as her own mother from Chicago society had picked a Harvard man, a bad choice. Instead, Graham swapped husbands with a friend, quickly divorced, remarried in Hidalgo, bought the farm. And then the wisdom passed to me with her engagement ring. Don't stay in bed late on Sundays unless you want a big family, she said. Perhaps in her blue jeans and red kerchief, she was teaching me, her preteen string bean, the best way to propagate is at a distance, where you can't smell the raw stench of sex, where it is practical, based on actual data for mating. 2. I found him online, displayed as if in that book of sires. I was in heat and it was August. I could not retreat. The irony wasn't lost on me, how he managed the air above waste dumps, making sure the levels didn't go above the permitted micrograms per year. My homage, he was an étier of garbage. He said he was an engineer. But how his microaggressions of Paco Rabanne were really endocrine disruptors, phthalates from petrochemicals he studied in the lab. Perfume is a code. I will change my allure chemically. But then a friend sent me an article, the new secondhand smoke, per, through, fumus, smoke. Perfume was killing us too. For the perfume is to cover up the truth, like the way the Oscar Mayer factory used to scent the air all around Madison, Wisconsin, near the airport with fake sweet strawberry scent. So no one thought about the entrails and bones of those bulls and their tortured burning. So there's another sort of slanted view of olfaction. But I really want to hear another poem of yours, Mark, so I'll turn it back over to you.
Well, there's, I'm sure we can have a great conversation about that. There's several things there. There's Madison, Wisconsin, the Oscar Mayer plant, and which we have in common there, and then the artificial insemination catalog, which is something I'm familiar with from my rural upbringing. But so I'm going to read a poem. I will read one. It's another poem about coldness, but it also, because you read about cows, this one is also about a ruminant. It's about a reindeer. And I will just preface this by saying that a few years ago, I went to northern Sweden, and I went on a reindeer sledding and winter camping excursion for 10 days. So I was in far northern Lapland, north of the Arctic Circle, and I was out with a Sami reindeer herder and on a sled that was being pulled by a reindeer. And then at night we were camping in mostly in tents, and then during the day we would go on these extremely long treks, and we went over into across a good part of northern Finland, and then back to Swedish Lapland. And so this is a prose poem, and it begins with a quote. The title of it is the name of one of the places we went, which was Haukajärvi, Sweden. And it begins with a quote from The Snow Queen by Hans Christian Andersen. "You are so clever," said the reindeer. "I know you can tie all the winds of the world with a piece of twine." Nasti, Gargalas, Liinoaivi, Squalmeyuni, tied to birch saplings digging in the snow. With hooves wide as salad plates, they paw to form a basin into which they fold themselves and lie down in their bowl of ice. They are not kind. They are not our friends. They are not unkind. They would not exist without us. By day, Squalmeyoni pulls my sled. I harness him in the morning and he shakes his antlers to chase me off, but I persist and buckle the colorful girth around his ribs. His hair is hollow and cold to the touch and smells of animal secrets. In my pocket, I carry the meal of the day, which is smoked reindeer wrapped in bread. I pull my sled and place it behind him, his head bound, pulled the birch rods to either side and clip them in the hooks, my hands freezing to the metal before I can shove them into the fur mittens. Jonas will lead us with Nasti and let his reindeer loose, holding the long rein and jumping onto his sled with a small hop. My deer will tear after him, anxious and strong, bounding through the snow to follow. On the trail, there is no speaking, only the clacking of the sled poles and the clicking of hooves as the rear hits the dewclaw of the front, the runners creaking in their tracks, and the bellows of the reindeer lungs pumping into the air with a woof. At night, we sleep on boughs of spruce, our breath crusting the canvas of the tent. I bury my hands in the fur of the hide where I will lie, my breath steaming, the Wolverine lake indifferent to the wan, somnambulant sun. Outside, the reindeer grunt and sigh, listen to our quiet talking rising up the flue with the smoke. We boil coffee and make confessions under the aurora, the sky aswirl with the icy chips of stars. Starface, escape artist, whitehead, Roman nose, tied to birch saplings digging in the snow.
Mm. That's so beautiful, Mark.
Well, thank you. Thank you.
The reindeers seem like spiritual. They're almost earthly gods in the poem.
They're extraordinary animals. And, you know, what was so interesting was spending time with them. I mean, I grew up riding horses and I've spent a lot of time around domestic animals. And, but these were something different entirely. They're half wild, you know, and the animals they use as draft animals, the ones they use to pull, are all weathered males. They're all castrated males. And so they're quite big. They're incredibly strong. They don't really like you very much. They don't like people. They're not, you know, they cooperate, but I don't know if you've ever been around camels. You know, camels are kind of indifferent to people a little bit, like they're not actually cuddly. And they would do these things as you would walk by them. They would, you know, shake their head and whack you with their antlers. They have these like giant things.
Wow.
They're kind of, you know, they kick, but they also really seem to enjoy pulling. You know, when they're behind in these sort of traces, they just love running. And it was so thrilling to kind of hop on this sled and have this creature pulling you through this landscape, which is, you know, there's 3 feet of snow on the ground. It's really cold, incredibly cold, but thrilling, you know, to sort of move through this landscape with this animal, hearing it and smelling it, and spending that time with it. It was probably the most adventurous thing I've ever done, and one of the most exciting times I ever had.
Yeah. How fast do they go?
They can go, you know, I mean, they're pulling your weight and then a pack on it. The sleds are really lightweight. I wish I was good at sort of calculating that, but I would say about as fast as you can go on a, you know, an average person bicycling rather fast. That's about how fast you'd be going, you know. And it's surprising, it's surprising when there isn't a whole lot of friction in the snow with the sled. If the conditions are good, you really just flew, and it was quite something.
That's so exciting.
Um,
What I love about the poem too is that it gives me a sense of terror and beauty, and sort of a mashing together of them. And in that way, it's kind of Rilkean as well. And I don't know, what did you like? What it was the takeaway for you? There's the poem, the beautiful poem that you brought home with you. But what was sort of the takeaway knowledge about yourself and about yourself as a person in the world from that experience?
wow, that's quite a question. I would say there was a sort of revelation that I guess I had when I was there, was um, how little one actually needs
Mm-hmm.
in some ways. I mean, there was a way in which things became very elemental.
Mm-hmm.
There was whatever food you were going to eat. There was the fire at night. The kind of things that you began to look forward to were these very kind of primal comforts, warmth,
Mm-hmm.
food, but also the kind of thrill of movement. The thing about that part of the world at that time of year in the middle of the winter is that there are no smells.
Mm-hmm.
There are hardly any birds. The only other living animals we saw were other reindeer kind of milling around in the forests, sort of wild
Wow.
ones that were out there. That was it, and not a lot of those. It's a very, very still place north of the Arctic Circle. And so when you do encounter other living things, it's very exciting, it's because you sort of note them and see them. The Aurora Borealis was phenomenal. Every night you would see it. And after thrilling to it about 3 nights in a row, when it appeared the 4th night, I remember being like, there it is again. It was sort of strange how this thing that is like a miracle, you can't even believe it's putting on that show. And then it became normal. It became this sort of normal thing. And that was I was disappointed in myself that you become slightly inured to this, phenomenon that is just quite spectacular. But I want to ask you about this. So this was a poem. It's sort of the opposing poem to the Perfume, where we've got a sausage factory and a dairy farm and the semen catalog, And so this is the sort of this other piece of it. And I'm wondering, you said that your mother, she went into fashion and perfume because she had grown up on a dairy farm, and I would just like to hear, sort of hear more about that. Is it this idea of the kind of smells, the dirt, the perhaps a kind of crudeness to the idea of the dairy farmer? Why do you suppose she made that decision? And what's your attraction to it? Or do you have an attraction, or is it something that you've kind of put well behind you?
I think that there's a real truth to that sort of old adage that grandparents and grandchildren get along so well because they have a common enemy, And I was the eldest child, so I was sent to the farm every summer, every vacation, because my mother had 3 children, and that was a lot for her. I think it was just like she wanted to be a city slicker, she wanted more than one pair of shoes. Like, she grew up in, a rural area in the 1950s. And, as a lesbian teenager, not out by any means, and not out for most of her life. And I think, the lure of the city and meeting somebody so exotic like my father, who grew up in Brooklyn and had this kind of family that was, like an immigrant family, and she could lose herself in that. And I think, she used to say to us, if you children don't behave yourselves and I lose my job, we're going to have to move back to Delhi. Like it was some kind of really bad thing. And I'd be like, okay, I'll just keep acting really, really badly. But So I think that was it. The wanting to go to the big city and make her way was very appealing to her.
Well, maybe you read another poem.
Okay. Let's see here. So this poem is about olfactory virtual reality. A close artist friend of mine, when I was telling him about these poems, he's like, "Oh, you got to meet my friend who runs this olfactory virtual reality program that he's turning into a thing for vets who have PTSD as a way to help cure PTSD through scent." And so I was like, "Oh yeah, I got to go over there." So it's about my experience with that technology, and I'll let it go from there. It's called The Ordinary Odor of Reality. It is as strong as our bones, steeped in our bodies. Outer space smells like rum, so says spectral analysis. But all my trauma reeks of baby powder and chlorine. We breathe 86,400 times a day. We ingest each other through our nostrils, straight into our amygdala, like 80s cocaine or salt water over our heads. I have inhaled my worldview from the sterility of brutalist architecture, schoolrooms I have sat in. I am currently having a smell dialogue with mold and wet earth and sand that resides in the woods and playground inside my memory. What are your odor threat cues? Coolant, match strike, summer day, all arranged in form, a story. I put on the olfactory virtual reality headset that looks like space goggles with a scentograph that changes with each virtual image in order to confront the aqua velva, polyester bedspread, peppermint schnapps, urine, semen, tobacco, the capture and pillage of my 7th year. Now I wear a warrior headdress. I combat the reality of the moment that launched my career in PTSD, psychological treatment, imageal exposure, therapy to locate the past so I can crash back through on a treadmill with my space goggles, and therapist, and relive it to master it, and take a shovel to rebury it in that wet earth, but without me.
Wow. So I guess what I'll mention here is there's a little, I saw it in the chat, but if anyone has questions out there.
Oh, let's look at the chat.
Yeah, we don't have a question yet, but I thought I would just put the call out. If someone has a question, please go ahead and type it, and we'll answer it. So I'm gonna follow that with a poem, Liz. I'm gonna read one, and this is one. This is one for. So this is, we're doing this for the Brookline Booksmith, and thanks to everyone there for organizing this and inviting us to read. I'm delighted to be here. Yes,
really
and so this is a poem that actually takes place on the Cape. So I thought I would do that, and it's thinking of Boston and part south. So and it's called Wooden Box. For John to Carlo. John's ashes flew from Stockholm in a box Anders stowed in the overhead compartment, brought it across the ocean to Provincetown, and when he put it down on the little side table, it's as if a cloud formed and we all went solemn as an absence filled the house. He was there by not being there, more thought than form, like the hard-backed books coffined on the shelves. The box stood sentinel throughout the day while guests ate oysters and sipped champagne. Someone played the piano and others sang. And after the sun had set and we mourners had our say, we carried the box to the breakwater where, illegally we knew, we would consign him to the bay. Someone scooped some ash into a pill bottle to keep some portion on their shelf. I did not want a bit of that body here, so far beyond permission. Wanted him gone from this place as he did, the noose that took him, a looping final script. In the dark, Anders clambered down the slippery rocks, clutching the box to his chest. No one spoke as John was poured out into the bay, the ashes washed with mud and sand, unwritten in this way. So there's a funereal poem. Here's a question. Should I read it, Liz?
Mm-hmm.
Any thoughts about olfaction in other species?
Mm-hmm.
Humans are kind of inept in this department. Do you know Alexander Horowitz's work on canine olfaction? That's for you, Liz.
I don't know that work. It sounds fascinating, though. Yeah, dogs and smell. Sometimes my kids have likened me to a pup. You know, like they joke, you can smell something rotten in the freezer. But no, I'm not familiar with that. But yes, in terms of the animal world, our smell is not as developed as it could be. And there is so much that they actually don't know about human olfaction and the whys and how of it. And I secretly wonder if our olfaction and our ability to smell has lessened over time with pollution and also with the ways that our predatory ways have changed. But no, I will look for that. Thank you. That sounds really interesting. It makes me wonder too about reindeer and what their olfaction is like. But okay, here's one I've been sitting on. It says, since we scheduled this event, why do you think it is that scent is so easily overlooked in literature when it is actually the most closely connected to human memory? Well, I think that when we, as writers and humans, want to make an image, we automatically go to sight, especially if we're sighted. You know, I'm curious about how the blind would make images and if they would, you know, use more olfaction. But for sighted people, I think that we go to the visual so often and not to the other senses. And I found that in my work too. And I had to sort of change where I came from in terms of trying to relate to my reader, right? And saying, you know, it's like this, and have it be like something that was related to scent rather than to sight. So yeah, and one thinks of Proust when you think of scent and Baudelaire, and it is so much part of human memory. It's intractable. Just one scent can deliver you to the space, you know, of 20 years prior. I mean, maybe the other thing is too that because scent and memory are so personal, they're harder to connect with other people about, right? So we might see things more the same, but the way we smell and link it to memory might be different.
Liz, I have a question for you about this too. And sorry, I had a little technical interruption, so I just switched to my phone here. But what do you think of as the connection between sort of scent and poetry? You know, how is it that those things that you kind of moved back and forth between those two things?
Well, I think for me, it comes down to the Song of Songs. It's one of my favorite spiritual poems, you know, and in the Song of Songs, I'm particularly interested in the Shulamite, you know, King Solomon's favorite wife, and how they sing about all the different scents in the Song of Songs and the lyricism of that. And that really captured my imagination. And I wanted to inhabit scent in a sensual way as that work does. And so I started to look into uses of scent, particularly incense and other things that help with spirituality in a church or a temple setting. And one thing that was so fascinating to me, I read, so I guess it was someone's dissertation turned into a book, and it was all about scent and Judaism. And one of the incense that were left on the temple floor in honor to God were all of the scraps from circumcisions that had been done, and they lit them on fire as an incense to God. And once I read that, I was sort of just off and running, but
that's so awful. What a terrible idea. This sort of smell of burning foreskin. It looks like there's another question here about coldness. So someone wanted to know, has cold always been evocative for me? And I would say, yes, I think so. I've always, I absolutely hate hot weather. I find I just melt. I just perish. And so, you know, coldness, the winter, I've always loved it. And I've always found it a time of kind of interiority, of contemplation, of turning inward. It was like the time when, you know, when you could just spend a lot of time inside reading and no one would bother you. That seemed like a perfectly reasonable thing to do. And I guess I've always been, for a long time, I spent a lot of time traveling to places in the winter, very sort of extremely cold places in the winter, like Lapland. And I spent a month in the northernmost town in Iceland in January one year, and spent another time in a very, very cold place in northern Finland for a long time. So I've always been kind of drawn to it, and I like the way it sort of pares the world back a little bit and sort of exposes its the kind of fretwork, and so I've always kind of liked that very much. But you know, spring is, I think, it's so violent. There's so much like breaking through the soil and things happening. And then in the summer, everything is just breeding and eating each other. And, you know, it's just then dying and rotting. It seems so like too much. And, you know, I loathe the beach. Like, I just think the beach, except in the winter, like a bony frozen beach is great, but like a summer beach is just an awful place. There's sand everywhere. The idea of like lying in the sun is just, you know, not something all that enjoyable. So anyway, I do prefer kind of cold and frozen places. So there's an answer to a question. Do we have other questions, Liz? Can you see it?
Yes, this Greg asks, Mark, what scents do you wear? Which I was thinking I wanted to know too. So thank you, Greg, for asking that.
Well, isn't that interesting? You know, it's sort of funny, like in, I saw this sort of funny meme where it's talking about, you know, gay culture is like not wearing any deodorant and spending, you know, $80 on a skin toner. You know, I sort of, there's a lot of, you know, it's interesting, like a lot of men really dislike scent, just like colognes and smells like that. In fact, someone out there in the audience, I have a friend who said that his favorite scent that he occasionally used to wear was WD-40, which was one that he liked, which actually does smell really good. Sort of definitely a butch smell. But I do have a couple of fragrances, and actually I sprayed a little. I cleaned myself up today. I sprayed a little on. I like 4711. Talk about old lady smells. But I like 4711. This is like the original cologne. And it's the German company, beautiful blue bottle. I sometimes wear that. I like its citrusiness. For a long time, I wore a Nick Goutal, Eau d'Adrien, it was called. And I had been given a little sample, and then I actually I was in Paris, and I went to the store and I bought some of it, and I absolutely loved it. And then I just have never reproduced it or worn it again. But I tend to like, I have a, boy, you were talking about, what was the perfume from the 80s that, 20-year-olds in the 80s, they made it for 20-year-olds in the 80s, but then it became like an old lady smell?
Yeah. Chanel Cristal.
Chanel Cristal. So I kind of feel that way a little bit about like Polo, which when I smell it, it's like every like high school football player you had a crush on. That's what that smells like. It really takes me back. And occasionally, and it's like, it's in poor taste. Like it's it's considered to be in poor taste. I smell that and I'm just like, oh, I love it. I don't own any of it. It's I don't really own a lot of, I think I have like two different kind of fragrance that I sometimes wear, but only on sort of special occasions really. I don't wear it every day.
I love that you wear 4711 sometimes. That was my very first boyfriend's scent.
Oh. I associated with a boss. I had this German boss, and he wore it, and he wore it a lot. And I just have always loved that smell. I don't know that it even smells like much of anything on me, but I just sort of like the aura of it a little bit.
It's not overwhelming at all. It's so subtle, and I really like it a lot.
Well, when it was originally made, I do know something about it. When they first made it, it was actually a medicinal. It was thought to be medicinal, and people drank it, like the original formula. So it wasn't even used as a cologne. It was it was a medicinal, and people would drink it when it was first made. I think it was like made in the 1780s or something. It's very old. It's very old. So
that's great.
Do we have any other questions out there? You see? Oh, you're muted, Elizabeth.
Oh, sorry. Hi, Jennifer. It's nice to see you. She asks, can each of you talk about the relationship between the concrete and abstract as you were writing the poems in these new books that deal with concepts like cold and scent? Mark, do you want to go first?
Sure. The concrete. Well, I have like a little poetry formula, which is that an abstraction plus an abstraction equals 0. An abstraction plus the concrete equals poetry. And so, I think that for me, poetry is really about the kind of minute particulars. It's about engaging with the material world and describing it as a way of transcending it, as a way of kind of moving through it and beyond it. And so, how do we experience coldness? We experience it in our bodies. We experience it as, this sort of elemental thing that is happening to us. And so it's affecting our physical selves. And so I want to create a world for people when they're reading a poem. I want them to be able to enter into something, see it, imagine it, and experience it. And it's in describing, through description, I arrive at some kind of revelation typically. How about you, Elizabeth?
Similarly, you know, the concrete, no ideas, but in things. And then I would try to narrow down the thinginess of it, you know, just try and be more and more specific of the thinginess. And then I used to teach this book called, I forget what it was called. It was like Chase Twitchell, The Practice of Poetry. It had a bunch of good prompts in it. And this prompt I used to always give, I sometimes do myself all the time, is to take an abstract word and then come up with as many images for that abstraction as you can. I think she calls it abstraction solitaire. And so I sometimes when I'm bored or the poem wasn't moving, I would just play that abstraction solitaire and then it would be fun. And so that was one way, just trying to get to the particulars of thinginess and then just getting at metaphor and image whenever I encountered an abstraction. But sometimes you need an abstract word or an abstraction in a poem to balance out that tension. But that's a great question. Thanks, Jennifer.
Yeah. It looks like we're kind of reaching the end of our hour. And do we need to do a kind of sign off here? Perhaps so. Oh, there.
Yeah. Hi. Thank you both so much. That was fantastic. Both of your poems they're all so evocative of like a time and a place. I absolutely felt like I could be there and smell there. So thank you both so much. Everyone, you can find both Mark and Elizabeth's books at brooklinebooksmith.com. If you are interested in upcoming events, you can go to brooklinebooksmith.com/events, and we have everything listed there. Thank you all for a really lovely evening.
Well, and thank you to Brookline Booksmith, but and Elizabeth, to you for such a great and engaging hour. This was so much fun, and I really enjoyed having this back and forth and sharing poems and thinking with you. It was really a treat.
I feel that just the same way, Mark. I really enjoyed your beautiful poems about the cold and the snow and the rural and pastoral landscape, really close to my heart. And the way you write them is so beautiful and so, it just really filled my heart. So thank you. And thank you to Brookline Booksmith for having us. And this was really fun.
All right.
Thank you so much. Good night.
Good
Good night, everybody.